And I thought the two new ones that everyone is talking about is solriamfetol and pitolisant. And I think until now, I mean, my practice was, we had modafinil and we had, maybe Ritalin and the amphetamines, but really the side effects of all of those were quite worrisome. Not so much modafinil, but certainly on the amphetamine side. So I'm interested from just a learning perspective and learning a little bit more about these new drugs. Maybe Dr. Kozlowski can talk about solriamfetol, and when should we be using it? Is it a first line? Is it a second line? Is the data good today that we should start prescribing these for patients with hypersomnia?
That's a great question. I'll have to familiarize myself more with the guidelines and the data from these particular products, but I just could speak to a high level of the fact that it's exciting that new products are emerging on the market. I think there's a lot of hope with that. And then I can just say that, from a regulatory perspective, in order for any product to be approved, the regulators have to conduct a thorough, risk-benefit analysis that comes from very rigid guardrails for, the bar of safety and efficacy. So I think it's really exciting that we have these new treatments that are emerging.
Right. Chris or Vito, have you seen patients come in with these prescriptions yet, Sunosi or solriamfetol?
I haven't seen them yet.
No, okay.
They're still fairly new.
They're fairly new, yes.
They're probably very expensive.
Well, yeah, that's the problem with the pitolisant. You're looking at $200 a dose, so it's going to be cost prohibitive for, and the insurance companies are not going to pay for it right away.
Yeah. Has anybody on this panel actually used either the solriamfetol or pitolisant? I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually a speaker for pitolisant, believe it or not. But the solriamfetol I've definitely used. Obviously, the indications are for EDS with OSA and also in narcolepsy. But the pitolisant is only for narcolepsy, so you obviously have to go through approval process and show that the patient does have narcolepsy, and usually by an MSLT. And I found that drug to be incredibly helpful. It's not really, believe it or not, it's technically not a stimulant. So it's not a controlled, and the main reason is because it doesn't affect the dopamine transporter, which is sort of the general rule for stimulants. But so it's a weird drug because it takes actually a number of weeks to work. It may take up to 6 weeks for it to work. And it also got an indication not only for narcolepsy, for EDS for narcolepsy, but also for cataplexy. So it definitely decreases cataplectic episodes, which I mean, a lot of things do. But so I find that what's really interesting, it's interesting you're asking that, Jagdeep, is that what I found is that drug and also sodium oxybate, in a narcoleptic patient, it's probably the first time I can actually sort of recapitulate like a normal phenotype. Like patients can really feel pretty good with narcolepsy if they're on one of those two drugs, the sodium oxybate or pitolisant.
Yeah.
Solriamfetol, definitely find it to be helpful. I mean, I don't think it's maybe a little bit better than modafinil and armodafinil. And the only concern I have with that, just like with modafinil, armodafinil, and stimulants, is whether it's going to interrupt or fragment sleep at night. So you just want to be careful about that. But overall, they're pretty well tolerated.
It does have a very long half-life, though.
What's that?
I'm sorry?
It does have a very long half-life, so,
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, even with stimulants, what I found, especially when you look for it, even in children, especially if they're taking it twice a day, invariably you get fragmentation of sleep at night, and then it sort of becomes a necessity taking it because their fragmentation is significant and they're sleepy the next day. And my little litmus test of that is if they take a holiday, how do they feel? If they tell me that they're exhausted on the days they're not taking that medicine, especially for ADD or ADHD, then I'm worried about it.
I think we're lucky to have a neurologist on this panel. I'm super curious to know, from a neurology perspective, Dr. Sheikh, do you use stimulants in your practice? And any concerns or tips you can give us, from your experience?
Yeah, so I tend to stay away from stimulants actually. As I mentioned before, migraine is a huge part of my practice, and the stimulants, especially like Adderall, I tend to notice in patients actually worsens their headaches, worsens their migraines. So it's not something I typically go to. If they're already on it, or if they're put on it by their psychiatrist, for example, like some things like Adderall for ADD, I tend to prefer the extended release. That one is not as bad, but yeah, I've noticed a lot that it can cause worsening of migraines or new headaches sometimes. So I tend to stay away from it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think from my own experience, patients seem to respond either to one stimulant or another, better. And sometimes it's hard to predict. Somebody who might respond very poorly to modafinil might respond to solriamfetol. And so I really, sometimes it's a little bit of a trial and error in these patients. But the cost is an issue. And I think with stimulants, I always worry too about, underlying mental health issues. Because, certainly if somebody is manic or something like that, they can certainly cause, pretty significant issues. And again, long-term side effects, hypertension, tremulousness, headache, all of those things they're not trivial. So I like the fact that, as Dr. Lown was pointing out, I mean, we do have to have a definitive diagnosis. For me, I always feel more comfortable using a stimulant if I can show that the MSLT has, hey, a mean sleep latency of less than 8, we know that these are true narcoleptics or true primary hypersomnia, then I tend to be a little bit more aggressive. But otherwise, I too like to stay away from these drugs.
So I have a question around just the the issue of hypersomnia to begin with. We have the hypersomnia relative to either OSA or narcolepsy, but I've had patients that they had the the multiple sleep latency tests, and they've been kind of diagnosed as idiopathic, and they tried the modafinil, Provigil, and they're really a management problem, which has become a big problem. So my question really is there any treatment for these, and somebody mentioned the word, you truly have to diagnose them. These undiagnosed idiopathic, they come in as an idiopathic hypersomnia. Where do I go with these patients?
So you're asking $1 million question, but you're always asking the good questions. So that is a huge problem, because we know that the frequency of narcolepsy is probably 1 in 2,000. So the numbers aren't high, but both companies, both Harmony, which makes pitolisant, and also Jazz, which makes sodium oxybate, are actually looking at the idiopathic hypersomnia population. They're trying to get an indication for that, which is probably, I don't know how easy it's going to be, because as Christopher mentioned, both of those drugs are very expensive. But what we try to do, I'm not saying I'm successful, it's sort of the Wild West, is try to figure out what I can do to defragment their sleep. Because even in the classic, pentet of narcolepsy, one of the symptoms is sleep fragmentation. So you kind of forget about it in narcolepsy. You think, oh, it's more about, EDS and about sleep attacks and about sleep hallucinations and sleep paralysis. A key component is actually that sleep fragmentation. And the argument I would make is the OSA patient that has a lot of EDS really has not just fragmentation from the sleep apnea, but they have this sort of destabilization in sleep in general. And that's why they're so tired. And if you look at it, there was a paper from 2007 Terry Weaver did when she was at UPenn. She looked at actually almost 200 patients with OSA, moderate to severe OSA, and they actually did MSLTs on them while they're using their CPAPs. And what's bizarre is that they had over 50% of patients that were using CPAP for 6 hours or more that still objectively had abnormal MSLTs. So more than half had an abnormal MSLT and they're using their CPAP. So what you're asking, Barry, is $1 million question. How do we get these patients to feel better? And like I said, anecdotally, I try medicine sometimes at night to see if I can defragment their sleep, but it's really empiric. Nobody has any recommendation yet. We're hoping, obviously, for approval theoretically of sodium oxybate, maybe pitolisant in the future, but you're absolutely correct. That's the general thing.
And what is the relation with, you know, hypocretin, orexin? Is that, are they,
Yeah, so obviously classically in type 1 narcolepsy, you have low orexin levels. And what's interesting about orexin is that not only is it is helpful for stabilization of wakefulness, but it's also helpful for stabilization of sleep. So you really should have like a shutdown of orexin at night, and that obviously can lead to better sleep. And for unclear reasons, the loss of orexin in narcoleptics, and they're usually less than 110 picograms in terms of the CSF measurement, those patients can have tremendous fragmentation of sleep. But the idiopathic hypersomnia patients, or even the type 2 narcoleptic patients, don't really have low orexin levels. So you don't know always why they're sleepy, but I would say at least the general, it's something that's fragmenting their sleep. And like I said, it's a huge problem, Barry.